So Breaking Israel News covers news from a biblical perspective, and we talked to Chris beforehand about how that, to do that responsibly. But one of, we encounter many fascinating topics, but things that are, we're breaking new ground from a Jewish perspective, reporting on news from Israel to Christian readership. And there are not a lot of people who get it and who we can go to when we have questions of like how to communicate certain things and how to approach certain topics. And David Nekrutman was always somebody who got it, who really gets it. And David is finishing a degree in theology from the Oral Roberts University. That sets him apart from just about everyone else on the planet with a kippah on his head. And David really understands what does it mean, this relationship between Jews and Christians, as the executive director of the Center for Jewish-Christian Understanding and Cooperation. And he understands, these topics very well. And the question for you, David, because of your theology background, you're not a journalist, but you're a theologian. And how does a person of faith, from a Jewish perspective, how does a Jewish person of faith report the news relating to Israel? And how does a person of faith read the news about Israel?
It's a great question. First, I want to say it's an honor to co-sponsor the event with you. When you first asked me, I said definitely this is something that we need to bring both Jews and Christians together. The center is the focus on the relationship itself. There are many organizations that work on support for Israel. The center specifically deals with the relationship between Jews and Christians specifically, because for 2,000 years we haven't had a normal conversation between the two faith communities. Jews don't know about the 30,000 different movements in Christianity, and I would dare to say that many Christians don't know the different movements within Judaism. Because someone is Orthodox doesn't mean necessarily they are a monolith. Someone wears a kippah like mine compared to someone who wears a black hat or a fur hat, and depending upon the socks you wear within Orthodox Judaism. And then there's Reform and Conservative, and some are culturally Jewish. So there is sort of an ignorance on each side as far as who you are and how do you relate to me. And the question is sometimes we have well intentions to go ahead and develop a relationship, but the very words that we say can actually blow up the relationship before it has a chance to actually take hold and actually build up. And so for 17 years of my life, I have dedicated my entire soul into the sacred calling of Jewish-Christian relations. And it began almost the same time as Chris came here to Israel. I was at the Israeli consulate in New York. And when the Intifada broke out, there was a Christian church in Brooklyn, New York that did a night to celebrate Israel in Spanish. I didn't speak Spanish, but the Deputy Consul General did. And literally an hour before Shabbat, he calls me up saying, I can't go to this church that's only a half a mile walking distance from my house. Can you go instead of me? And that was a real dilemma for me, because how I grew up within Orthodox Judaism is that walking into a church from a very strict legal point of view is forbidden. So even though I confess in front of you today that I valued my job and I said yes to my boss, but for the Jews in the room I needed to get a heter, a dispensation, to allow for me to be going into church. And I called up my rabbi and I got the dispensation. But what I knew of you back then was that you were all medieval Catholics. And I ended up in a charismatic Pentecostal tongue church. Didn't know those terms back then, but it wasn't what I pictured of Sister Act 2 in the movies. I just thought everyone wears habits and brown robes with ropes and organ music and stained glass windows. So coming from that perspective in Borough Park, Brooklyn, New York, which would be considered the B'nai Brak of the United States, and now 17 years later, coming to a conference like this, I think it's been said more and more every single time every panelist has seen this, but this is I would not say prophecy, I'm saying it's a miracle. All right? And These miracles shouldn't be taken lightly because you mentioned a statistic, Thule, at the beginning of 2 billion people who identify themselves as Christians. Okay, there is a debate within Christianity who's a Jew, who's a Christian, just like in Judaism, who's a Jew, and it's complicated as far as the different movements are concerned. I didn't know anything back then, and now I'm here, finishing a master's in Christian theology at a Spirit-filled university. That doesn't happen every day, and that's the testament of the miracle. But we should also understand that not every Christian is on board with where you are in the audience today. And we have to appreciate the miracle of a remnant within Christianity and a remnant within Judaism willing to go ahead and pioneer a path to make this relationship happen as a relationship, to know each other, and understand each other. And it's not easy. There are bumps in the road, there are things that are done, we usually misjudge it, we're assuming something on somebody, and we take that assumption, we take it to where the relationship doesn't have a chance to thrive. For me, as a Jew, who's after 2,000 years has made Aliyah as a fulfillment of prayer coming back to this land, is not only prophetic, but it's part of the national narrative of who we are as the Jewish people. But it cannot be divorced without the nations of the world. And when I have seen, at least within Christianity, that is made up of different nations of the world, there has been a move as an atonement of the past of what was done in the name of Jesus to the Jewish people. Not only that, being very proactive in the call of Israel. But it doesn't mean there are hundreds of millions of Christians out there doing this. And therefore, I want to say thank you for those who are standing in the gap. But part of this process, if we're looking at prophecy, as anyone who believes in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, a covenantal God that is interested in our everyday lives, that really writes history. New York Times op-ed doesn't determine the fate of the Jewish people. I'm not here to preach. I'm here to go ahead. I don't want to preach to the choir. I think there has been many people in the room who already understand this. But if part of what I'm talking about as far as the relationship, if you're only looking at Isaiah and you're only looking at Ezekiel and you're not looking at the national narrative that Moses' farewell speech called the Book of Deuteronomy, then we're missing an essential point of how you're going to interpret events that are going to be coming out from the city of David or being reported by Chris or reported by David. And that is chapter 30 in the Book of Deuteronomy. Okay, essentially, this is we call it a parsha, a Torah portion of the week that we actually read between the Shabbat that's between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, called Shabbat Shuvah, to return. And in chapter 30, in just verses 1 through 10, I'm just going to zone in on verse 2. And zone in on verse 2 in the Hebrew says, you will return up until God, your God. In the English translation, you don't have that Hebrew word ad. Ad means until. It's a really weird word to insert to the Jewish people. This is in-gathering of the Jewish people. And then at the end, in verse 10, it says, at the end of the verse, you will return to God, your God, with all your heart and with all your soul. There is a process that the Jewish people have to go through in order to understand and appreciate the love of God for them, for us, our relationships with others, and trying to deal with post-traumatic syndrome at the same time. The proof of God's love is the return of the Jewish people to the land. That's the proof of God's love. When I saw last night in our hands, and I must confess I cried at the end, because they were able to reenact the emotion with the personal testimonies of what it meant to liberate Jerusalem. Sometimes we have an idealized way of looking at the liberation of Jerusalem, but the soldiers who were doing this had to deal with the generations of the past, their brothers dying along the way and burying them, and what that meant, and the aftermath. And that is a process. And there was one part in the movie that one was saying a supplication prayer called Tachnun, which we say every day in our own prayers, of forgiveness and asking God for his mercy. And the other one saying, while you're saying this prayer, let's say Hallel. Let's say Psalms 113 to 118, these amazing psalms to give gratitude to God about his divine intervention in human history. And one couldn't come to that point of Hallel for that gratitude because of what he was going through emotionally at the moment. And a lot of times what we are going through as the Jewish people, where a lot of times Christians are not understanding that and therefore are using a prophetic event for some type of end time theology, is they're not allowing us to be who we are in order to come to terms of who we are as a nation. This is really new. 2,000 years of exile took a toll on the people. All right? And the church was responsible for this. All right? And we have Christians in the room atoning for the past, but please understand the 2,000 years of the church did a toll on us. Okay? And it's not easy having a relationship with the Christian world because of the historical past that's really recent. So it's where there's a theological conundrum for a Christian towards a Jew of how he or she gets their salvation. For the Jewish people to have a relationship for a Christian, there is a historical memory we must overcome in order to have that relationship. So when you're interpreting an event like the liberation, again, of Yehuda v'Shomron and Jerusalem, we can't forget about Yehuda v'Shomron, that process needs to unfold within us. We, as the Jewish people, need to come to terms of who we are and be comfortable in that. And once we're there, that's the end stage of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 10, that it's about the love of God for his people, and we're finally understanding what that love means. So when I hear about people using certain prophetic events to sell millions of books because they interpreted an event because that they want to rush something, I must say that's offensive, at least from my point of view, to the Jewish people, because it can't go according to your timetable. First, it goes according to God's timetable. God makes everything happen, but he's so graceful in allowing things to happen that we struggle as Jews to go ahead and come to terms with that. And that's grace. And that's the beauty of the relationship between God and his people, but it's not about us solely. At the end of the day, it's about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being known to the world. But first and foremost, as a people, we have to come to terms with it. So when I see sometimes events are taking place and being used as ways to sell books, I'm saying to you, please, I understand there's an interpretive lens to all this, but never forget the process. Rabbi Yehuda Glick just touched upon it this morning, but really, at the end of the day, this is an amazing miracle and opportunity and stewardship that we have of a liberated Yehuda v'Shomron in Jerusalem. And believe me, it's not easy. Okay? As much as I don't agree with Haaretz, the most left-wing liberal paper there is in Israel, but that too must be celebrated. That too must be given a voice, even though I might not agree, because that's part of the unfolding of who we are as a people. Right, left, secular, religious, Sephardic, Ashkenaz. We are coming together. This is amazing about Israel. You can be in a Jerusalem cafe, and you're literally in the ingathering of the nations. It's right there. I don't have to prove a God. Richard Dawkins, I think it's very hard to be an atheist. It's very easy to be a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But we must never take away the allowance of the Jewish people to be who they are and let us recoup and heal. And once we're there, and once we have working on our relationships of people in the past that we didn't have a great relationship with, then the glory of God would be totally revealed for everyone to acknowledge. I don't want my enemies to be hurt. I want my enemies' hearts to be transformed, to love the God that I love so much, that loves me so much. Thank you.